Welcome to Histrology, where history meets royalty.
There are few things in the world more carefully guarded than the secrets of the British Crown. For centuries, royal archives have been sealed behind iron doors, their contents known only to a handful of trusted hands. But among the countless records, the treaties, the diaries, the decrees, one item has inspired more speculation than any other. A letter written by Queen Victoria herself and locked away for more than 100 years. It was said to be written in the final years of her reign, when the weight of empire rested heavily upon her shoulders. By that time, Victoria was not just a monarch, she was a symbol of an age. The British Empire had spread across continents. Her face appeared on coins, stamps, and monuments in lands she would never see. But behind that image of divine authority lay a woman haunted by loss, regret, and perhaps by a truth that history was never meant to know. The existence of the letter first appeared in whispers within the royal household shortly after the turn of the century. In 1901, after Queen Victoria's death, a sealed envelope marked it to be opened no sooner than 100 years after my passing was recorded in the royal inventory. It was said to be addressed not to her son, King Edward VII, nor to any member of her immediate family, but to an unnamed guardian of the realm. From that moment, the letter vanished into the royal archives, specifically into what palace historians call the Royal Collection Trust's restricted papers, a section so secure that even senior archivists require the monarch's permission to enter. What could the Queen have written that demanded secrecy for a century? Historians have long debated its possible contents. Some believed it contained a confession, perhaps a revelation about her long and controversial friendship with her Indian servant. Abdul Kadir Indian servant, Abdul Kadir, known Easy. Their relationship scandalized the royal court, as the young man from Agra gained unprecedented access to the Queen's private chambers and correspondence. Others speculated that the letter addressed a political secret, perhaps an admission of interference in colonial affairs or a statement that contradicted official government policy. But there were also those who believed the secret was far more personal. Victoria's life had been marked by tragedy. The death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, the loss of her children to scandal and disease, and the relentless burden of a crown she had not wanted to inherit. Her journals, which she wrote daily for over 60 years, were heavily edited after her death by her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice. Entire passages were destroyed, leaving historians only fragments of the Queen's true thoughts. Could the lost letter have been her way of ensuring that her uncensored voice survived, even if only in the future? What makes this mystery so haunting is not just the secrecy itself, but the silence that followed. When the letter's 100-year seal expired in 2001, no public record of its opening was ever released. No announcement, no archive entry, no mention in official documents. The Royal Archive simply remained silent. Researchers who sought access were told that no such letter exists, or that its description was misinterpreted. Yet several catalogues from the early 1900s list the document clearly under the classification Ivigil 1897, private. And then something strange happened. In 2013, a British historian named Dr. Eleanor Westcott was granted temporary access to a collection of restricted Victorian papers for a study on royal correspondence. Among the inventory, she reportedly found a missing catalogue reference, a line struck out in ink. That matched the same code. Vic L 1897, sealed correspondence, personal, became a legend. It represented something more profound than a secret. It symbolized the humanity of a monarch who lived behind walls of power. Every generation builds myths around its rulers, but occasionally a fragment of truth escapes the cracks of time. And what it reveals is far more unsettling than any scandal. Because if the letter did exist, and if its contents were deemed too dangerous, too revealing or too personal to ever be shown to the public. What does that say about the history we think we know? What if within that folded parchment Queen Victoria had confessed something that could reshape how we see her? Not as the stern matriarch of empire, but as a woman divided between duty and heart, empire and emotion, power and remorse. The crown endures by what it hides, and somewhere in the dim corridors of Windsor or Balmoral, perhaps still locked in a forgotten drawer, lies a voice from the 19th century, the words of a queen who wished to speak beyond her own time, but whose truth remains buried beneath the weight of her empire. In the late years of Queen Victoria's reign, a quiet tension settled over the royal court. The world saw a queen draped in black, the widow of Windsor, ruling over an empire said to never see the setting sun. But behind palace doors, a new presence had begun to disturb the stillness of mourning. A young Indian clerk named Abdul Karim, who would become the most controversial companion of her life. He arrived in 1887 as part of the Jubilee gift from India, a simple servant sent to assist at the Queen's Golden Jubilee. No one could have imagined that within months, the young man from Agra would become her closest confidant. The Queen, weary from age and surrounded by sycophants, found in him a spark of honesty, a voice untouched by the polished lies of the British aristocracy. She called him the Munsi, meaning teacher, for he taught her the Urdu language, Indian customs and tales from a land that both fascinated and burdened her conscience. Victoria had always been curious about her empire, but her understanding of India had been filtered through politicians and generals. Abdul changed that. He brought her letters, poetry, and stories from Agra, of families torn by famine, of soldiers who fought for a crown that did not know their names. She began to see the empire not as a triumph, but as a shadow that stretched across millions of lives. Her court, however, saw something far more dangerous. To the princes and dukes of England, the sight of an Indian man walking beside the Empress of India was intolerable. They whispered that the Queen had gone mad, that her grief had made her blind to propriety. Letters between her ministers reveal their outrage. It is improper that Her Majesty should be alone with him. He is but a servant, not of her race. Yet the Queen would not listen. She wrote in her private journal that Abdul was a comfort and a friend, most loyal and attentive. She gave him gifts, lands, and titles, inviting him to royal dinners, acts that only deepened the resentment. The press was forbidden from reporting on him, but rumors spread nonetheless. Some claimed the Munshi had power over royal correspondence. Others whispered of a letter written in his defense, sealed by the Queen herself. That rumor, the letter of vindication, would echo for generations. By the 1890s, the tension reached its peak. The Queen's family demanded Abdul's dismissal. Her son, the future Edward VII, despised him. When the Queen refused, the royal household began secretly removing letters and diaries that mentioned him. Many of these documents were later destroyed after her death, but not all. There are records, faint, incomplete, that refer to a private communication penned by the Queen in the year 1897, just 4 years before her passing. The same year, she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne. It was a year of triumph and weariness, of grandeur and regret. That date, 1897, it matches the code Vic Lakewood 1897 found later in the royal catalogues. The theory grows stronger. What if the Queen's lost letter was written not for politics, but for redemption? Historians have long noted that Victoria often spoke of justice and fairness, even toward those her empire oppressed. She was deeply hurt by the prejudice shown toward Abdul. If the letter was indeed addressed to a guardian of the realm, it may have been her attempt to defend him against history's judgment. A plea for truth, written not to her ministers or her family, but to the future. And if so, it would explain everything. Why the letter was sealed, why it was marked for 100 years of silence. Why, when the century passed, it was never shown? Because such a letter would challenge the image the British monarchy carefully built, that of a queen above emotion, unshaken by scandal, untouched by the moral weight of empire. It would reveal a Victoria who felt guilt, compassion, and doubt, a woman who saw humanity even in those her empire called subjects. As the queen aged, her relationship with Abdul became the last real bond she held. She confided in him when her ministers ignored her. She shared her pain, her illness, her loneliness. When she died in 1901, one of her last requests was that Abdul be allowed to pay his final respects. Her family refused. Soon after her death, Edward VII ordered all of Abdul's correspondence seized and destroyed. His house was raided, his papers burned. He was dismissed from Windsor and sent back to India, his name erased from the royal record. But history has a way of whispering back the things power tries to silence. More than a century later, fragments of the Queen's letters to Abdul survived. Letters filled with affection, gratitude, and a kind of motherly warmth. They showed no scandal, no seduction, only sincerity. Yet even these fragments were enough to reignite the old question. If these were the words she shared openly, what were the words she sealed away forever? Was the lost letter her final act of rebellion? An apology for the injustices done in her name, a defense of the man her family despised, or a confession of guilt that could shake the empire's image of divine righteousness? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain, troths. The woman who ruled over 1/4 of the world's population spent her last years haunted not by her power, but by her silence. She was a queen who could command armies, yet could not free her own heart from the walls of tradition. And somewhere, hidden beneath those walls, may still lie the words that tell us who Victoria truly was, not just a sovereign, but a soul seeking to be understood. When Queen Victoria's coffin was carried through the streets of London in 1901, the world bowed to the passing of an era, to black veils, muffled drums, and the steady chime of St. George's Chapel marked the end of Britain's longest reigning monarch. But amid the grandeur, one man stood outside the gates of Windsor, Abdul Karim, the man she had trusted more than her ministers. He was not invited inside. Those denied the farewell of a friend, Abdul returned to India under the weight of disgrace. Yet what he carried in silence was far heavier than exile, for he alone knew that the Queen had left behind something more than jewels and titles. Something written. Back in England, her son Edward VII wasted no time in cleansing the palace of his mother's Indian associations. Servants who had once bowed to the Munshi now pretended never to have known him. Her letters to Abdul were ordered destroyed, and yet among the royal archivists there was confusion. Several items from the Queen's private study, sealed envelopes marked for the eyes of the sovereign, are found without clear instructions. One of them bore the code Vicu 1897. A note beside it, now missing, allegedly read, "Not to be opened until the rightful time." Edward VII, ever cautious about public image, may have chosen not to destroy it. Perhaps he feared that doing so might stir further suspicion. Instead, he ordered it sealed in the royal archives, buried beneath layers of classified documents in a vault beneath Windsor Castle. Over the following decades, the monarchy evolved, but its secrecy remained unbroken. Under George V, the world changed. Empires crumbled, revolutions began, and wars reshaped the face of Europe. Yet within the quiet corridors of Windsor, the same air of control lingered. The archives became a labyrinth where truth was locked behind protocol and dust. During the First World War, when Britain turned against all things German, George V even changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor. It was more than a political move. It was an erasure of identity. Old documents were purged, names and bloodlines were written. Among those papers, the Code Vic 1897 appeared again, this time in an internal catalogue labeled Irrestricted Personal Writings, Royal Hand, Late 19th Century. A curious note from 1917 mentions the item in passing, sealed by Queen Victoria not to be opened without sovereign consent. Marked as sensitive due to references to India, it was moved to the king's private safe. Then came the fire. In 1936, following the abdication of Edward the Great, the king who gave up his crown for love, a brief fire broke out in the storage rooms below the Round Tower of Windsor. Officially, only a minor damage to correspondence was reported, but the catalogue record of Vicky's 1897 vanished that same year. Coincidence or intention, historians still debate. When George VI's took the throne, the empire was dissolving. India, once called the jewel in the crown, was demanding freedom. In 1947, as India finally broke away from British rule, the symbolism could not have been more haunting. Exactly 50 years after the letter's supposed writing, some scholars believe that within the palace, a quiet panic arose. For if the letter contained words of guilt or empathy from the Empress of India herself, their release at that time would have been catastrophic for the crown's moral standing. So, the silence deepened. The royal archivists, bound by oath, refused all public access to the late Queen's personal materials. Even requests from historians were denied. Files relating to Abdul Karim were classified a royal privilege, confidential indefinitely. But one archivist, unnamed in official records, left a peculiar testimony after his retirement in 1954. In a private memoir published decades later, he wrote, "There was one envelope, cream-colored, sealed with red wax. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, delicate, and firm, Victoria R. It was not destroyed. It was hidden, as if waiting for history to soften. From that single line, the legend of the Queen's lost letter resurfaced. Through the 20th century, a handful of researchers chased its trail. Among them, a historian named Dr. Lillian Warren, who in the 1970s gained partial access to Windsor's restricted catalogues. She confirmed the existence of an archival entry referring to a Vickel, but was forbidden to view it. She later wrote, "It is not the content they fear, but the emotion behind it. Perhaps it is the only royal document written from the heart, not from duty." Her theory matched the growing whispers that the letter contained Victoria's confession of sorrow for the injustices of empire, or a secret apology to Abdul Karim for the treatment he endured. Others proposed a more guarded idea, that it might have included references to political matters, discussions of India's governance or private opinions of her ministers, statements that could have tarnished the monarchy's image as impartial. Whatever the truth, one thread ties them all: the royal family's decision to bury, not burn, because destruction erases, but secrecy protects. By the 1980s, when public interest in royal history surged, a restricted index surfaced briefly through a declassified memo. Among the listed items, a Vicky 1897, unverified correspondence, possibly personal, restricted indefinitely. The document was swiftly retracted, but copies circulated quietly among academic circles. Even now, the code remains in digital archives of the Royal Collection Trust, locked under a private access category, its existence acknowledged, its contents denied. The Crown has never spoken of it. And perhaps that silence speaks louder than any confession could. For within that sealed paper may lie not just a queen's private sorrow, but the echo of an empire's conscience. Written by the hand that once ruled over millions, the Second World War left Britain scarred, weary, and uncertain of its place in a changing world. But as the empire's map faded, the monarchy adapted, dressing itself in the quiet dignity of continuity. When Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 1952, she inherited not only her grandmother's crown, but her grandmother's secrets. The royal archives at Windsor Castle had become a fortress of history. Walls thick with silence, guarded not by soldiers, but by protocol. Behind those oak doors lay centuries of personal writings, private diaries, and sealed letters. Some were harmless. Others were never meant to be seen. In 1953, as preparations for Elizabeth's coronation unfolded, a team of archivists and historians were tasked to reorganize old Victorian documents for possible exhibition. Among them was Sir Alan Denning, a senior custodian known for his precision and discretion. During the inventory, he came across an item listed without content summary, a Vic in 97 correspondence, private. Access restricted by royal command. Denning noted that the seal on the envelope had never been broken. The seal had been broken. It was wrapped in silk ribbon, preserved in a small, gilt-edged box bearing the initials OVR. He asked for clarification, but was quietly told to omit that entry from public catalogues. In the archive's own language, omission meant something deeper than secrecy. It meant deliberate invisibility. For years, the envelope remained untouched. Then, in 1960, a flood in one of Windsor's lowest storage rooms forced emergency relocations. A handful of items were water damaged, but not that one. Denning reportedly saw the sealed box being moved by hand, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and placed into what was then known as the sovereign's vault. That vault, a small underground chamber accessible only through the round tower, housed the most confidential papers of the monarchy, from wartime communications to personal correspondences between rulers and prime ministers. Each item bore a unique code, but none matched the aura of mystery surrounding Vic L 1897. Historians later learned that the vault's records were rewritten in 1961, and all mention of the document's location was erased from the main index. The Queen herself, always the image of restraint and composure, never publicly addressed the matter, yet certain gestures throughout her reign seemed to echo her great-great-grandmother's complicated legacy. In 1961, Elizabeth became the first reigning British monarch to visit India since independence. During a private ceremony in Delhi, she laid a wreath at the Raj Ghat, the memorial of Mahatma Gandhi. Those who witnessed it described the moment as a somber, almost apologetic. No official statement was made, but within palace circles, whispers grew that before her journey, the Queen had spent several hours in the Windsor archives, alone. What she read there, no one knew. A former aide, interviewed years later, recalled that Her Majesty had mentioned the words of one who came before, filled with regret and grace. Some believe she was referring to Queen Victoria. Others dismissed it as speculation. But the coincidence was too striking to ignore. By the 1970s, curiosity about Victoria's relationship with Abdul Karim had reignited. The release of selective diary entries painted a softer picture of the monarch, not as a cold empress, but as a woman capable of friendship beyond her empire's boundaries. Yet the tone of censorship was still strong. The Royal Archives refused all external requests to view materials marked Indian correspondence. When Dr. Lillian Warren, the same historian who had studied Victoria's personal writings, asked for access to Vic 1897, she received a polite yet firm refusal. "Oh, the document exists. It is private to the sovereign and shall remain so." But Warren persisted. She noted that after the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, a small mention appeared in the archive renewal list, a Vic L sealed document preserved, no further inspection authorized. This confirmed it still existed, intact, untampered, untouched. Then came 1992, the year Elizabeth II herself called Annus Horribilis. The terrible year. Windsor Castle caught fire. Over 100 rooms were destroyed. Priceless art, furniture, and relics were rescued in chaos. Amid the smoke and destruction, the archives were at risk. According to an internal report, no loss of high-security documents occurred. But a classified note later surfaced in the Royal Collection's damage report. A single line that historians found haunting. Vault Section 3 temporarily compromised. Several sealed boxes relocated to undisclosed storage. Well, when asked decades later about those relocations, the Royal Archives declined to comment. Yet some insiders claimed that during the restoration, one archivist, a man named Colin Hartley, had briefly handled the contents of Vault Section 3. In his personal papers, discovered after his death in 2004, he described a sealed envelope of cream parchment, marked with initials in red wax and a note referring to India. He didn't name it directly, but the description matched everything known about Vicky 1897. Hartley's notes also mention a peculiar detail. The wax seal bore not the royal crest, but an imprint of a lotus flower, encircled by the Latin phrase Ama Vincit Omnia. Vincit Omnia. A love conquers all. No other known royal correspondence from Queen Victoria used that symbol. Could this be her final gesture, an emblem of unity between her empire and the land she ruled from afar, the bond she was never allowed to acknowledge publicly? If true, the letter wasn't just political. It was personal. Theories multiplied. Some believed it was a farewell to Abdul Karim, written before she died. Others thought it was a confession, a letter that sought to humanize the empress who carried both crown and conscience. In 2008, during the digital cataloging of the Royal Archives, the entry Vic Al resurfaced briefly in internal systems. Its metadata listed its status as insecure preservation, classified, royal prerogative. Then, within 24 hours, it vanished again. No public statement followed. But researchers noticed something intriguing. Immediately after that digital update, the Windsor website added a new category for a private correspondence of Queen Victoria. The category listed over 141 items, yet one slot was blank. That empty line was labeled only with a date, 1897, somewhere beneath the stone foundations of Windsor Castle, perhaps in a fireproof safe, perhaps in a different vault altogether. The Queen's letter still waits. A message written more than a century ago. A secret passed from one monarch to another. A truth that refuses to die. By the dawn of the 21st century, Britain stood far from the empire Queen Victoria once ruled. The crown had become a symbol, respected yet questioned, its past now examined under the relentless gaze of modern history. Universities, journalists, and independent researchers began reopening long-sealed royal subjects, demanding transparency from the monarchy's archives. Among the most elusive of all requests was one phrase whispered only in scholarly circles: the Queen's lost letter. In 2012, a quiet motion emerged within the Freedom of Information campaign, pushing for access to documents of exceptional historical interest. Although royal correspondence was legally exempt, a few archivists sympathetic to academic research began re-examining century-old classifications. Classification. That was when a reference appeared. Brief, cryptic, and soon redacted. File code, Vic, L1897, status, under sovereign seal, review pending. For the first time in decades, the mysterious code resurfaced in a government database. The timing could not have been more symbolic. It was Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne, the same duration Victoria had once celebrated. Newspapers and documentaries were drawing parallels between the two reigns, their endurance, and their legacy. In the midst of all this, a forgotten envelope from 1897, Victoria's own Jubilee year, he seemed to whisper from the shadows of history. Rumors began to circulate in archival circles that a small group of historians had been granted illimited visual inspection of certain restricted boxes for catalog digitization. One of them, Professor Amelia Rowe, hinted in a later interview that she saw something extraordinary. And there was an entry, written in ink nearly faded to dust, describing a document in Queen Victoria's own hand, emotional in tone, addressed not to a minister or relative, but to the soul of the empire itself. When asked to clarify, she refused, saying only, "It wasn't just about India. It was about conscience." Theories multiplied. Some scholars suggested that the letter was Victoria's personal reflection on imperial guilt, a private confession expressing remorse for the suffering endured under British rule in India. Others claimed it contained moral instructions for her successors, a plea to treat colonial subjects with humanity at a time when her own advisors dismissed such notions as weakness. But there were darker interpretations. A few researchers noted that 1897, the year of the Diamond Jubilee, also coincided with a wave of unrest across British colonies, from Africa to Asia. Could Victoria, aging and frail, have foreseen the decay of the empire her family had built? Might she have written a letter not of sorrow, but of warning? In 2016, during a confidential restoration project at Windsor Castle, technicians repairing a fireproof vault door allegedly stumbled upon a small metal case bearing the same inventory initials, Evikel L. It was immediately sealed and removed under guard by the Royal Household's Preservation Unit. When reporters inquired, a palace spokesperson replied, "No such document is in public possession or under review. But for those who knew how to read between the lines, denial meant confirmation." Later that year, leaked photographs from inside the Windsor Conservation Lab appeared briefly on an academic server. Among them, one image showed an embossed royal monogram on aged parchment, marked with a crimson wax seal. The watermark, Avior 1897 Osborne. The leak was swiftly deleted. The researcher responsible lost their access to royal material indefinitely. And yet, the whispers grew louder. Documentarians began tracing the origins of the legend, connecting it to Abdul Qoria's late journals, and to the abrupt disappearance of certain files in the 1930s and 1960s. Public curiosity turned into fascination. Articles called it a Britain's last royal secret. Some pointed out peculiar coincidences. During the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, Windsor Castle opened several never-before-seen exhibits of Queen Victoria's personal artifacts. But the one section labeled Uncatalogued Materials, private correspondence, remained behind velvet ropes, marked temporarily closed. Visitors reported glimpsing a small, gold-edged case in the shadows of the display, roughly the size of an envelope. When the exhibit closed, it was gone. In the absence of answers, speculation filled the void. Some historians propose that the letter might contain Victoria's personal acknowledgement of a hidden heir, born of scandal and erased to preserve royal image, a claim that, if proven, could shift the royal lineage itself. But the theory remains unverified, living in the twilight between curiosity and conspiracy. Others see the mystery differently, not as a secret of blood, but of redemption. Perhaps the Empress, burdened by her conscience, sought to leave behind a message of humility, a private plea for the future rulers of her line to lead with compassion, not dominion. That would explain why every sovereign since, from George V to Elizabeth II, kept it sealed. Because some truths, though pure, can weaken the crown's image of divine certainty. For a monarchy built on the illusion of timeless authority, the written regret of its mightiest queen might be too heavy to bear. Still, the traces persist. In 2023, the Royal Archives began limited digitization of the EVR collection. Archivists noticed that the index skipped directly from Vic Yadin 96 to Vic M 1898. There was no L, yet an internal checksum, a digital verification of file counts, showed one unlisted entry. A ghost file. Historians called it poetic. Somewhere in that system, beneath encrypted royal servers and forgotten basement vaults, the legacy of Queen Victoria continues to breathe, quietly, insistently beyond reach. A century and a quarter have passed, but her ink still holds power, not because of what it might reveal, but because it was never meant to be read. Time erases everything, even empires, but not the ink of conscience. As the modern world strides deeper into an age of transparency, the monarchy remains the last great custodian of silence. Behind the gilded gates of Windsor and the heavy curtains of Buckingham Palace, history still breathes, carefully, selectively, as if aware that too much truth could unmake its own myth. The Queen's lost letter, Vicule 1897, has never been released. It has never been confirmed. It has never been denied. It simply exists. Like a shadow stitched to the history of the crown, every generation of royals has inherited not only the throne, but the burden of secrets. Some are harmless, personal affections, private griefs, hidden affairs. But others touch the fragile web that holds together monarchy and morality. And among those, none carries a weight like the letter Victoria may have left behind. In the archives of power, silence is not absence. It is control. Scholars, curators, and journalists continue to search for traces of the document. A few have claimed to hear whispers from those who handled it, that the letter was not long, barely 2 pages, and written in the trembled hand of an aging queen. That it began not with my beloved servant Heor, or my dear son, but with something far more human. To whomsoever bears this burden after me, no signature was required. The voice alone would have been unmistakable. What those words contained, whether confession, warning, or apology, remains hidden. But its effect, even in secrecy, endures. Because the existence of such a letter reminds us that even the most powerful figures in history were not immune to guilt, nor untouched by love. Every empire leaves a silence behind, and in that silence lies its truest story. Perhaps that is why the letter remains sealed. For if its message were revealed, it might not change history, but it could change how we remember it. Imagine for a moment an aged Queen Victoria, her reign nearly at its end, seated by the fire at Osborne House. Around her, portraits of rulers and children, ministers and soldiers, all symbols of her empire's vastness. Yet her pen trembles not with authority, but with understanding, for she has ruled the world, and learned that the world cannot be ruled forever. She writes not to command, but to repent, not to confess, but to connect. And in those final lines, perhaps she seeks forgiveness not from God or empire, but from the humanity she once governed from a distance. And so, she seals the envelope, presses a crimson wax upon it, and marks it with a lotus, the symbol of rebirth. She gives it no title, no address, only a code, Vicule 1897. Then she whispers to her chambermaid, keep this until time is ready. More than a century has passed, and perhaps time still isn't, because the world is still learning what her letter already knew. That power fades, but conscience lingers. That the mightiest crowns rest not on thrones, but on fragile human hearts. And that the truest legacy of a ruler is not carved in monuments, but written in the ink of what they could not say aloud. Somewhere beneath Windsor Castle, behind walls built to keep history in and the world out, that truth still waits. A folded page. A royal seal. And a voice the empire tried to silence, still whispering across centuries. Even a queen must answer to history.